All Elite. Because I can't even call it wrestling anymore. Look at this clown. Look at this clown.
You were there, Tommy.
Dude, look. I call him a pencil neck. Look, his hair looks like an eraser. He literally looks like a pencil. And Tony, if your neck hurts that bad, why are you turning your head, you jackass? Oh my God.
I can cut a promo, baby. I can sit right there if you want a Dusty Rhodes promo. That's right, Daddy. I've wined and dined with kings and queens. I feasted on alley and pork and beans, Daddy, if you will. I can do it on
Ric Flair.
Woo! A little bit of flair. Look at that, man.
10 pounds of gold, baby.
Look at that belt, bro. Look at that robe, more importantly. Now that's a robe.
Yeah. Dave LaGreca, that is a robe.
Yes.
That crap that you have on.
Fuck Dave LaGreca. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Yankee Rebel Wrestlecast. I am Rebel Brian. Down below me is Yankee Tommy. And I tell you, I think we need to drink on an episode like this. Tonight is our part one of what really happened to Chris Benoit. I do want to do a disclaimer real fast if you're watching on our stream live. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of WWE, the Benoit family, or others involved. We do want to say that we have researched this. Are we going to come to any conclusions? Maybe. Are we going to probably create more conspiracy theories? Probably. But tonight we're going to be discussing Chris Benoit, the wrestler. And a lot of people, due to the incident, has forgot about Chris Benoit, the wrestler.
Yeah.
And Tommy, I know that this is a topic that is very near and dear to your heart.
Yeah.
Because you are a very big Chris Benoit wrestler fan. Because he came in, watched him WCW, came into WWE during the end of the Attitude Era into Ruthless Aggression Era. Let's talk about what Chris Benoit has meant to you over the years as a wrestler. Let's go ahead and exit the allegations, the deaths and all that, and let's talk about Chris Benoit, the wrestler.
We're just going to talk strictly about the professional wrestler, Chris Benoit. Now, when I was a lot younger and was able to understand wrestling a lot more and follow along with the storylines and everything, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, very synonymous with each other. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So I'm just going to talk about them both because they both meant a lot to me growing up when I was a young wrestling fan. Because, I mean, they made me feel something when I watched them both. I mean, they both might be polar opposites as far as, Eddie was pretty much your fun-loving, lie, cheat, steal, everyone loved him. Chris was one of the most intense wrestlers probably of all time. I mean, it's hard to think of anybody more intense than him. And it just really stood out to me, the work ethic and how much he cared about the business of professional wrestling. And, he's one of my personal all-time favorites in the ring. Just everything he gave, he was technically sound. Just laid it all out there. And as a wrestler, I mean, there wasn't much he couldn't do. I mean, he could submit you. He could pin you. He could do his high-flying headbutt, just was ruthless.
And didn't care about his teeth.
Toothless. I was just gonna say toothless aggression.
Toothless
One of
aggression.
one of the most underrated T-shirts ever made. But yeah, man, he was a different animal. I mean,
Well,
not
let's jump into some of the accolades that Chris Benoit did win and was a part of. Of course, we know that Chris Benoit was Canadian. He was he's basically held over 30 championships between WWF, WWE, WCW, New Japan, ECW, and Stampede Wrestling, where he started his career. Let's see, he was a two-time world champion. Benoit reigned as a one-time WCW World Heavyweight Champion, a one-time World Heavyweight Champion in WWE. He was booked to win a third championship event on the night of his death. Benoit was the 12th WWE Triple Crown Champion and the 7th WCW Triple Crown Champion and the second of four men in history to achieve both the WCW and WWE Triple Crown Championships. He was also a 2004 Royal Rumble winner, joining Shawn Michaels and preceding Edge as one of the three men to win a Royal Rumble as the number one entrant. Benoit also headlined multiple pay-per-views for WWE, including a victory in the World Heavyweight Championship at WrestleMania 20 in March of 2004.
which just I mean, which was lead to probably one of the greatest WrestleMania moments of all time that is never talked about anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, when I saw that, I cried my eyes out because just I knew how much it meant to both of them, and to see Chris finally get his due after just being U.S. champion and just about. I mean, he was the bout for bout machine, the best bout machine before Kenny Omega was ever thought of. That
Yeah.
man. I mean, every match he had, you could put in the. I hate to bring up Dave Meltzer's, 5-star system, but I mean, I don't think he ever had a real bad match ever.
Well, speaking of Dave Meltzer, he actually considers Benoit one of the top 10, maybe top 5 of all time in pro wrestling history with technical wrestling, holds, takedowns, submissions, and grappling.
I mean, I don't agree with him on much, but I would have to agree on that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
it's
don't agree with him too much either.
it's hard to argue that when you just take just the style he had and just like he was a complete wrestler. He could give you everything you wanted and was really shit on because of his size. I mean, he wasn't the biggest cat in the world, but he was strong. He just wasn't tall, and that's what they loved back then.
Other accolades that Benoit did receive is he was inducted into the Stampede Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1995. He was also inducted in 2003 to the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. And of course, we know that he was born in Montreal, Quebec. He idolized the Dynamite Kid as he was growing up, which we know was one half of the British Bulldogs. And he was actually trained in the Hart family dungeon as a wrestler as well, which could say a lot for his wrestling ability
Mm-hmm.
because the Wicked Hart does not go to the Hart family dungeon because that is that is one of those things where you got to be a tough son of a bitch to be able to do that.
Yeah.
He also began his wrestling career in 1985, and he became WCW World Champion in 1992. And that to me was also another great match that he became champion in WCW because around that time, you had Flair, you had Sting, you had Dusty Rhodes, you had all of these guys that Magnum TA, even that the guys that could really carry the company, but WCW entrusted Benoit to be the world champion in 92. It also states in a record that He came back to WCW in January of '93 at Clash of the Champions 22. He defeated Brad Armstrong, which, rest in peace, one of the greatest wrestlers of that era. A month later at Super Brawl 3, he lost to Two Cold Scorpio, getting pinned with only 3 seconds left of a 20-minute time limit match. And at the same time, he formed a tag team with Bobby Eaton. A lot of people don't remember that,
Yeah.
of the Midnight Express. And he and Eaton lost to Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell at Slamboree, and Benoit headed to Japan after that, where he had a very, very nice career in New Japan.
Yeah, like people also forget he was a member of the Four Horsemen.
Yes, he was.
So, back in that time, he was world champion. He was walking around with, Flair and the boys and the Four Horsemen. So, the man was just starting to really build his foundation to eventually when, the Radicals went to WWE and then kind of all branched off and, really unfortunately, only Eddie and Chris really achieved that prominence. Perry Saturn was the butt of all jokes, and Dean Malenko was just he just wasn't. I don't think he was built for WWE. If we were gonna put him in today's era, he'd be AEW all day, which is where ironically he is now.
Yeah.
Because AEW focuses more, I think, more on the wrestling, and WWE is just a blend. You have to have a character, you have to connect, and I think that was, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you love Dean Malenko, a little bit to his detriment. He really didn't have a character that really resonated with WWE fans.
He was a very quiet, silent warrior. Dean Malenko was in the ring, and so was Benoit to a certain extent, because Benoit, let's face it, not the greatest promo guy of all time, but
No.
he still got the message out when he was on the mic. But neither was Dean Malenko, and I think that Dean Malenko just stayed silent so much, and he was one of those guys that you could depend on, but he didn't have the charisma that Chris Benoit had.
Yeah, because like in the ring, Chris Benoit was very charismatic. Because I was watching again because I watched it when it first came out, but the Dark Side of the Ring, and you saw when Chris was even in Japan, like he started to do like the whole like neck thing, kind of like what like Taker used to do, but like he's kind of went like this, and then in WWE that evolved to it went the whole, and then
Yeah.
threw it down like he it evolved, it connected, people loved it because they just were on that ride that Chris took him on. Because ring psychology, second to none. He was, I mean, Jericho was quoted saying, Chris knew what was coming before it happened. He just was so good in the ring at calling stuff and knew what was going to work, and it was just magic.
Well, let's talk about that WCW era. That cruiserweight division was absolutely probably some of the best that could ever be. You had Benoit, you had Dean Malenko, you had Jericho, you had Rey Mysterio, even Juventud Guerrero. Juventud was amazing, at least till he took his mask off, and just an elite group of wrestlers that would basically be like, oh my God, I've got to follow this match. The matches that they had in the cruiserweight division was absolutely some of the best professional wrestling we will ever see.
Yeah.
And Benoit was a part of that. He was one of those guys that could go toe to toe and still be in the Four Horsemen at the same time.
Yeah, that era is the greatest cruiserweight era you're ever going to see because, you mentioned the Juventudes, the Malenkos, Guerreros, Mysterios, Benoits, like some of the best workers you're going to find in the history of the sport. And they're all on, Nitro every single week, just cranking out these banger matches, and they really drew a lot of eyes onto WCW. And things are a little wonky at times. You're like, I'm excited for the cruiserweights because the
Well, and
cruiser,
most of the time they started the event. Like if it was a pay per view, they started the pay per view, and it was kind of like when Kyle O'Reilly and Bobby Fish would start a match on an NXT pay per view. You knew it was going to be a banger.
yeah,
It's kind of the same way that the cruiserweight division did for WCW in that era. You knew that this was going to be a banger match to start the pay per view.
yeah. Because I mean, if you got them starting or ending in the car, you know shit's about to go down.
Yeah.
Like it's about to be a barn burner of barn burners because you know those guys can go 60 minutes easy and not bat an eye.
Well, we also know that in July of 2002, Benoit defeated Rob Van Dam on one edition of Raw to become the Intercontinental Champion for the fourth time. So Benoit held titles, and I feel like that, and it's an unpopular thing. Anytime you talk about Chris Benoit, it's going to be unpopular, but his IC title runs were some of the best because one, they actually put him with people he could wrestle.
Yeah.
And very good opponents. I mean, let's face it, the 2008 run between him and Booker T was some of the greatest matches of that Ruthless Aggression era. They absolutely had a great feud, and Benoit held the Intercontinental title, he held the US title, and of course the World
You're
Championship
talking
title.
about when they had like the oh my gosh, it was like the best of 7 series.
Yes.
Yeah, that was great. And I mean, when you talk about his US title runs and his IC title runs, you know if you beat Chris Benoit for any one of those belts, what the company thought of you because of how they thought of him.
Yeah.
Because he made those titles worth having. Well, like you wanted that title because you wanted to go against the best, and he was one of the best, just bout machines. And if you could beat him, that said a lot about what the company thought about you. And there's not many guys who can win even if they lose,
Yeah.
because that's what he did. He elevated people. Maybe if they didn't even need elevating, he lifted anyone who wrestled with him up and just made the matches just legendary and made them mean something. So
One thing that I forgot about while we were doing research on this entire topic was the fact that he was a tag team champion with Edge.
yeah,
And they had a big feud with La Resistance, which wasn't a bad run in. You know, I mean La Resistance was kind of like the Spirit Squad of WWE at that time, but it actually states that that they lost the titles to La Resistance um, on the May 31st episode of Raw, while simultaneously having confrontations with Kane over the World Heavyweight title. Benoit wrestled in 2 matches at Bad Blood. In respective rivalries, he and Edge failed to regain the tag team titles by disqualification when Kane interfered when he successfully defended the World Heavyweight title. And a month later at Vengeance, Benoit retained the title against Triple H. And if you can beat Triple H and you get the push to beat Triple H, you know that you are in good graces with upper management.
yeah, yeah. I wish his world title run would have went longer than it did. Because you know when Randy got his first, I was happy for Randy. I mean, I was a Randy Orton fan, but
Yeah.
I just wish they would have given Chris the opportunity to hold that a little bit longer because I felt like he had deserved at least that.
Also, don't forget that 2005 Benoit was drafted to SmackDown first pick, and he appeared at ECW One Night Stand, defeating Eddie Guerrero.
That to me is one of my all-time favorite matches. Since you bring it up, I mean that pay-per-view, top to bottom, is one of the best that WWE has had. Granted, it was ECW, but that was the most ECW that ECW was ever going to be in WWE.
Absolutely.
But to see those worlds collide, because Benoit and Guerrero were in ECW at one point.
Yes.
You know, you had the originals, you had the Dreamer, Sandman. I mean, and Paul Heyman giving just one of his best promos he's ever given. You know, like, this ain't Monday Night Raw, this ain't SmackDown, this is EC fucking W.
Yeah.
Just top to bottom, one of my favorite pay-per-views of all time.
Well, let's talk about some of the finishers that Benoit used, and how it solidifies him, as Dave Meltzer would say, one of the top 10s, one of the top 5 greatest wrestlers of all time. You know, you had the flying headbutt, you had the crossface, you had multiple submission moves. What moves resonated with you, being a Benoit fan for as many years as you were?
It was, I mean, hands down, it's the crippler crossface.
Yeah.
You know, when he locks that in around your nose and mouth, you ain't getting out of it. I mean, he had vice grips for hands. His forearms were bigger than some people's heads. People forget how big he...
Do you think it was more effective than Cena's the STFU? Do you think?
Yeah.
Because he went with the neck on the STFU, where Benoit basically used your face and basically bent you back. Do you think that it's more effective?
I think Benoit's more effective, because Cena's, it's way easier to get out because he locks it up.
Yeah.
For those of you listening to us on podcast, he locks his forearms up and leaves that opening in between your biceps and your chest to slide out. Where Benoit, he left you no room. That was right up in the bridge of your nose. His knuckles were pushing up into your nose. And when he wrenched you back, good luck.
And a guy with short arms, that was amazing.
Oh my dude, he pulled some shit off. I mean, every move he made in the ring had a purpose. And many people nowadays, it's a lost art, in my opinion. I mean, like, people always take too much time gloating, looking out in the crowd. This man was bell to bell. He was moving. He didn't waste no time.
What do you feel is the top 2 or 3 greatest rivalries that Benoit ever had?
I mean, obviously Guerrero, because no matter where he went, they had a feud, and they put on clinics that I think any wrestler getting into the business should watch. You could just back of their matches in Japan where he was Pegasus Kid, and Eddie, I forget what his name was. So like, he had the mask on and his cowboy boots. Definitely him, and then, oh god, he had a lot of them. I like the match with him and Kurt Angle.
Yeah.
Him and Kurt had me dying sometimes, because Kurt was kind of in between his comical and, you know, his wrestling machine gimmick. So I just love those two. Those two are kind of what sticks out to me, because they were just clinics, and it was just cool to see back then, because it was starting to kind of get into the whole sports entertainment. But guys like Angle, Benoit, Guerrero, they gave you all of that, and not many wrestlers could do that back then. It was either one or the other.
How awesome is it that Benoit and Eddie Guerrero wrestled each other WCW, New Japan, ECW, and WWE? I mean, that is, if not long-time storytelling, I have no idea what is.
Right, and then that's why, I mean, that's my number one rival. I mean, his best friend. His best friend, they have chemistry. So obviously, anytime they get in the ring, it's going to be absolute insanity.
And they never put on a bad match.
Never, never. No, I mean like Eddie and Benoit, I don't think could ever have a bad match. Even I mean, they might have a match or two where it's like really, but that they themselves never had a bad match. Now, to break it down a little further, if you ask, I mean, like if you were to ask Chris that, I'm sure he would tell you absolutely not because Jericho is quoted in saying on the Dark Side of the Ring that there was a match that they had to where Benoit just beat himself up because he thought he messed up one of the spots where like Jericho did his like spinning kick and he fell wrong and it's just like it wasn't televised so no one noticed but Chris noticed and afterwards he was doing 500 of some type of squat. He did just 500 squats after the show to kind of almost like self punish himself because he didn't perform to the best of his ability. If that tells you anything about him, the wrestler.
Let's take a turn. We're waiting for part 2 next week to get into the entire rough issues with the deaths and everything and go into our spiel with that. But let's talk about the steroids. Let's talk about that. I mean, is that speculation or do we have an actual 100% that Benoit was a steroid user?
I was reading an article today. Let me see if I can pull it up. From the New York Times. And if you remember, um, Christopher Nowinski. He used to wrestle. He wasn't obviously super great. Had concussions and left. And he's like the head of the, like the CTE studies. And even reading some of like the autopsy reports and whatnot, he did use steroids. He did use that. And we'll break it down next week, kind of the effects of steroids, obviously, versus the CTE part of it, and how that may or may not have played into everything. But he definitely did do them. There was a history of it, because obviously you saw his WCW physique to his WWE physique.
Which
It's kind of
all the guys were doing it. I mean,
right. I mean, it doesn't make it right or wrong, but that was the culture back then.
Yeah.
Especially for those smaller guys like Eddie and Chris, they had to bulk up so that they would be seen as okay. They may not be the tallest guys in the world, but these guys have the size that we like. You know, I feel like it put an unfair pressure on them to do something they probably wouldn't. Because if you look at Chris in the early '90s and you look at him in that picture we have on the screen holding the world title, two completely different people.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is documented. He did do steroids. But even in a lot of the interviews you hear, you don't hear any of that mentioned until the death. And that's when it all comes out. So I personally think it's a little unfair to stereotype him just in the steroid user club, even though he did use it. There wasn't really, to my knowledge, any documented instances where he had any roid rage or anything like that.
Well, I mean, and I feel like that possibly the steroids was one of the major reasons that Eddie died is because it's
drugs, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's and we know that his heart basically exploded in his hotel room due to possible drug use, possible steroid use and things of that nature, which just takes a toll on your body after a while because one, you have to keep it up or you start losing all that muscle mass and it's eventually, I mean, when you think that would get expensive for most of these wrestlers.
Yeah. And like those two back in the day, I mean, they're in the height of their careers, so I mean, depending on, I mean, from what I heard, Chris was a very frugal spender of his money. So, I mean, that might have been maybe his probably biggest expense beside travel was his steroids.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're being frugal everywhere else, you might, find an excuse or reason. I mean, it's like with any, I'll say, addiction. If you want it, you'll find a way to either justify it or just make it work. Not to offend anybody, but just to make it happen. Hey, I need this. I'll do what I need to get it.
Well, I mean, we got to look at the 80s as well. I mean, that was a big thing in the 80s. Guys like Ultimate Warrior. I mean, even Scott Steiner. I mean, when he first came into
Oh,
the business, he was about the size, of these other guys, and then he just completely jacked. I mean, I can't imagine the usage that was going on there.
yeah.
But it was a normal thing in which WWE did almost get in trouble because of it, which I
Oh, yeah.
think they came very close to having some really big problems once that steroid cases came out with them. But I mean, you can't just put the steroid use on a guy like Chris Benoit. You have to be able to look at the entire company and say, okay, how many of these guys, even the girls, are doing this?
Right.
And I think that's one thing with everything that happened with Benoit is that we're laying blame on steroid use when everybody else was doing it too.
Right. And, like an unpopular opinion is guns in the country, right?
Yeah,
You know, factually speaking, the guns don't kill people, the people behind them do it. So like, it's all, I mean, all that to say, it's not the steroids don't come to you inject, like you inject the steroid into yourself. It
yeah,
can't inject itself. So when you're going ahead and blaming steroids, well, no, you have to you whoever was taking it is to blame because you decided to put that in your body. Now, when it comes to wrestling, multiple other factors are obviously involved, especially when you're talking about Benoit, Guerrero, guys like that who are smaller that felt the internal pressure that I need to be bigger in order to succeed because they loved it so much. Not saying that's an excuse, but I can probably safe to say that's their mindset and that's what they were thinking.
yeah.
Would you agree?
I would agree big time. I mean, even guys like Jericho and Rey Mysterio, guys like that you're like, okay, am I going to be able to compete? I mean, even a Brian Danielson, you're like, am I going to be able to compete? And we know that back in that time frame, Vince didn't like small guys.
No.
He was more of a Undertaker, Brock Lesnar, Hulk Hogan kind
The
of.
Rock, Stone
Yeah,
Cold, bigger guy.
and I would feel like that even if the Stone Cold, for instance, if he wasn't as big as he was, we probably would have seen Steve Austin as a mid carder. But it was through that charisma and the other things, the sports entertainment side of it that Vince wanted, that created that great rivalry between Vince and Stone Cold. But Vince always liked the big guys. I mean, let's face it, man. WrestleMania 9, he put El Gigante in the ring in a full bodysuit and thought it was the greatest thing on the planet. And we know that it was one of the biggest botches of all time.
Yeah.
That, but he loves big guys. Just it's that's what he envisions wrestling to be. So I can only imagine the pressure guys like Jericho and Eddie Guerrero and Benoit that they had to face to be able to get to where they needed to be in the company.
Right. And you got to think with guys who literally that's their life and their families are second. Kind of like what Vicky Guerrero would say about Eddie. It's like wrestling was number one, family and God were a close second.
Yeah.
You know, with guys like that who care about the business that much, you got to just think the amount of pressure that they put on themselves every single day because they would often wrestle with serious injuries just because they were afraid that given their stature they'd be, forgotten or moved down the line for other guys if they were gone 4, 5, 6 months. So I mean that's not to be sleeping on is that aspect as well.
Well, the thing that I really enjoyed about Benoit was when he had his Intercontinental title reigns and his U.S. title reigns, he made the title relevant.
Yeah.
And when a guy is pushed to a mid card title, that's when wrestlers can become stagnant. They can feel like that they're not being respected enough. But he made that title relevant. And when that title was defended on pay-per-views, on Raw, on SmackDown, you know that it was going to be a good match because Benoit knew how to carry those titles.
Yeah, and I mean honestly, when I look at the United States title, he's the first name I think of
Yeah.
because he made that title when he was on SmackDown. He made that title one to want to have. I mean, honestly, any title he had, I would call it the workers' title
Yeah.
because you had to really work to get that thing off of him. And if you could beat him, that said a lot about you, like I mentioned earlier.
And a lot of people are like, they want to say, well, he didn't do any. I mean, because people want to focus on the death more than they focus on the wrestler. And that's why tonight we're breaking up the parts of the show from wrestler to the death situation. But look at today's Intercontinental and U.S. title championships. You got Sami Zayn, which is irrelevant. It is probably one of the worst IC title reigns I've ever seen in my life.
And Logan Paul, even more irrelevant. He's
He's a
hardly ever.
part-time champion.
Right.
Benoit wrestled every night, every Raw, every SmackDown, every house show, almost every pay-per-view. And he, like you said, this was the working man's titles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what there should be today. But we've got either people crying in the back, we need this, I need this, and nobody's going to defend it like Benoit did.
Right. And, I want to say over like the past 10 years, you see little spurts to where it's like, you had Gunther's legendary reign. You had
Yes.
Dolph Ziggler and The Miz go back and forth, and they really made those titles, mean something. But it's not consistent enough, and it's not being sustained like it should. Because back in the day, when you had Triple H and The Rock and Stone Cold, guys like that hold that belt, that was your trial run to catapult you to the world title.
Yeah.
And if you could hold the IC title and the US title and people were still digging you, okay, what's your soft title run? Now we think you're ready and we're going to bring you up to the big time.
Yeah.
But nowadays, that's non-existent. It's like holding the U.S. title and the Intercontinental title are essentially, demotions. Kind of like what John Cena said in his promo when Roman Reigns had his worst promo of his career. He's like, you saw the U.S. title as a demotion. I saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And it's that mindset that people nowadays don't have. That Benoit, any belt he had, he was going to make that thing relevant. And he was going to
Yeah.
make one you wanted to hold. But you don't see that nowadays.
So I want to give a few comments moving into next week, and I want us to focus on this again next week. Is that one thing that I find very eerie is Benoit was supposed to win the title basically the night before his death.
Right. I mean, Paul Heyman was going to give him the ECW title that night. He was going to be the ECW World Champion and be the pillar of the new ECW against
And
Punk. It was Punk, right? He was facing
yeah,
Punk,
yeah,
and then Punk ended up winning it, I think.
yeah, which started a good title run for Punk. But that's my first red flag. All I'm going to talk about tonight is one red flag. If I am a wrestler that is dedicated to wrestling, it's a little bit weird that I would go through something like that the night before I was supposed to win my championship.
Yeah, yeah, because you know how he's talked about his work ethic, his will to win, doing whatever it takes, and for that weekend to be one of the bigger weekends of his career, being a world champion, and he passes away that weekend. Like you said, it makes you wonder. You know, like it makes you pause and just think, like, well, that's like I said, that's weird.
It doesn't add up to me.
Well, a lot of this doesn't add up to me, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
Uh,
But I had to talk about one red flag because if I'm dedicated as Chris Benoit was to the business, and I'm going to win the title the next night, something just doesn't add up. Something in my spirit is like, this just doesn't seem right to me.
yeah, I'll mention one more before we kind of go back to another one of his accolades. Um, Nancy's sister. She was quoted in saying that uh, towards the end of Chris's life, and obviously after Eddie's death, kind of really just crippled him mentally, emotionally. He started to get very, very paranoid.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll get into all the why that may be or how or whatever. But he just when you're a guy who is known for not showing much emotion, and obviously Eddie Guerrero's death, nearly killed him when it
Yeah.
happened. He meant so much to him, and then just to see, you know, everything he went through, and he just and like through all that for 2 straight years, he wrestled, and then like you mentioned, the night he's supposed to win the world title, that he passes away. It doesn't it doesn't make sense because in my mind there's got to be something else there that you know we're not seeing. It's not being talked about or even known because like you take different routes to the gym and work and stuff. It's like, I mean, I understand that paranoia can make you do a lot of crazy things, but something's causing that paranoia, whether it's
Absolutely.
somebody or some circumstances that's making you uneasy. So it's a lot to break down, and I going forward, I just don't want people to just look at Benoit and say steroids
Yeah.
or this. It's not that simple. It's not that simple.
And we're going to blow your mind next week with a lot of the things that maybe you've never heard before that happened with this incident that I just found to be just unraveling, that you're just like, what? Why did this happen? And that's why next week is going to be so interesting, because we're going to dive into those topics, because you're just like, wow, that actually happened. And I just, when we talk about Chris Benoit, it's a tainted discussion. Either you are still a Chris Benoit fan or you have basically sent him to hell.
Yeah.
There's no happy medium when it comes to Chris Benoit.
It's there is no gray area. It is, for lack of a better term, it is black and white.
Yeah.
There is no gray area at all with this subject. Because I mean, like, I'm one of the biggest Chris Benoit fans, and I know Brian, you're a big fan of his too. And it's just sad that this event, obviously as tragic as it is, it's just tainted the 20 plus years that he put in, and he's now not even considered anything anywhere.
Well, if we're going to put blame on things, I mean, let's look at Jimmy Superfly Snuka, for God's sakes. I mean, the man wrestled being considered a murderer for years, but people still paid to see him wrestle. I mean, I don't understand, just because we take a situation, we forget about everything the man has done for the wrestling business.
Yeah, because you can't tell me that people who are wrestling nowadays weren't inspired by that man.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that he didn't inspire young kids, like a Bryan Danielson, who's one of the best technical wrestlers on the planet,
Yeah.
to get in the wrestling business. But you'll never hear that said because his name has been blackballed everywhere you look.
Everywhere.
So it's like you can't even say, oh yeah, who's my favorite wrestler, Chris Benoit. You can't even say that anymore because at that point you're siding with a murderer.
Yeah.
And it's like, why can't you respect the work he did and just not even get into any of that? Like, why can't we? Because when you wrestle, as you well know, because you've been in the wrestling business as well, that who you are in the ring is not always who you are outside of the ring.
Absolutely.
So, no one's trying to glorify the man, but we're respecting his accomplishments to what he did for the business, not mentioning the tragedy.
Plus, one of the greatest theme music of all time.
Oh my God. That song today is a banger. And, it's sad because, like, it's almost like that event was kind of, if you think about it in wrestling terms, almost the beginning of like a cancel culture.
Very.
Because I was even looking up stuff about Our Lady Peace in that song. And apparently as of 2012, they said they're no longer going to be playing that song live because of the Benoit ties. And I'm like, this is one of your songs that came out, and it was one of your songs, like, at least to my knowledge, it wasn't a song that was just for Benoit. It was a song that they came out with that obviously he wanted.
Yeah.
So, like, for at least them, in my opinion, to be like, nope, we're not going to play that song because of Chris Benoit thing. Really? By companies and, the certain industries to just completely ignore him on purpose, it makes people talk about him more.
Yeah.
I mean, if you mention the name Chris Benoit, the name is still relevant. The name still brings you emotion, whether it's remembering the good times or remembering the tragedy. It still invokes such a visceral response with people.
Yeah.
And it's like, I feel like if you at least, when the Royal Rumble comes up, if you just acknowledge, hey, the only two people to win from the number one spot, are Shawn Michaels and Chris Benoit. Hey, that's all you have to say. You don't need to go into extensive things about it, even though it was one of the greatest feats of strength when he, just flipped big, he had a Big Show underneath his arm and just pulled him out of the ring. That was insane. But it's like, you can acknowledge his accomplishments without glorifying him. As people always like to use, well, I'm not going to glorify him. Well, you don't have to. Just, his accomplishments were his accomplishments. And that's it.
I mean, we can look at other situations. I mean, Rick Steiner, Hogan using racial slurs. I mean, we can look at all this stuff, and cancel culture is a major problem in our country. And I think that even though let's just say that everything that everybody said, yes, he's done everything that's there. Well, yeah, that might have happened. And how tragic it is, and absolutely just horrendous. But are we just going to just lay down and say, okay, that was Chris Benoit the man, but are we going to forget Chris Benoit the wrestler? It just doesn't make sense to me that even though it was a horrible tragedy, and he, like I said, say he did it, you still can't erase it from history.
No, I mean, it happened. You can't, hit the delete button, like in your browser history, you can't just hit the delete button and it's gone. No, it happened. You might not like to talk about it, but it happened. It completely baffles me because, if we go into the music industry, Michael Jackson was convicted of child molestation and all this other shit. But yet he's still the king of pop. People still play his music. People still tribute stuff to him, and it's okay. So it's like, where do we draw a line? And what is that line? Because it's just, it doesn't make sense to me.
I agree. Let's talk accolades, and we'll finish this part one up, Tommy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, off the top of your head, Brian, what would, in your mind, is your favorite Chris Benoit either match, memory, or just something that kind of really resonates with you when it comes to him?
I would have to say Benoit versus Eddie Guerrero, Halloween Havoc. Halloween Havoc, because that match was absolutely one of the greatest wrestling matches I've ever seen. Other than the WrestleMania match, of course.
I mean, it's kind of hard to beat the Halloween Havoc one.
It is.
I mean, just from a technical perspective, and
it was at the height of their careers.
Yeah, and the emotional aspect of the WrestleMania match, obviously. Just that Jim Ross that was one of his best calls. One of his best calls. If you go back and you listen to that, if they haven't somehow edited all that shit out, just listen to that call. And if you don't get, the hair standing up on your arm, or you don't get a chill or something, exactly, you don't feel that, something's wrong with you. But one of my all-time favorites, and just looking at it, Benoit had a lot of good, just Royal Rumble individual matches, but the one with him and Kurt Angle at Royal Rumble 2003, I mean, that one was...
It's a good match. But it's two guys that knew each other well, and two guys with kind of similar wrestling backgrounds just going at it.
Well, yeah, because you had the Greco-Roman style with Benoit, you had the Olympic background with Angle, and they just were going blow for blow, suplex for suplex, submission for submission, and it was the ultimate, who was going to be the better guy tonight. And there's not many guys you can say for nowadays that can have those kind of matches. I mean, some guys in the AEW roster, like a Danielson, Omega when he's healthy, maybe an Osprey, but you're not going to have guys like that nowadays that can go just blow for blow like that and just put on a clinic.
Well, we're too interested in some good and some bad storylines, and we're too worried about flying off the top rope and doing tope suicidas and all that. Now, this was an era where wrestling was king. It wasn't, especially in WCW, it wasn't about sports entertainment. It was about how good are you in the ring. And I think that is when Benoit was probably the happiest, was when he was in WCW.
Speaking of WCW, do you happen to remember um, Benoit versus Bret Hart in the Owen Hart tribute match?
I do.
For that one, another good one. Like it's like you could pick any Benoit match that he had, and you can make a case that that's one of his best matches he's ever had because he perfected his craft. I mean, you know, something that may be so minor that even us as avid wrestling fans, wouldn't even think to look at. Somehow he knew what he did wrong, and it didn't look like he missed a beat. It's just insane mind for the business, and it,
I
and
agree.
and especially the attention to detail that he gave in every single match he had. But I implore all of you, go watch ECW One Night Stand 2005. Watch the whole show, but I want you to pay attention to the Benoit and Guerrero match
Yeah,
because it's honestly one of the best matches they both ever have. Because at that point, I want to say Eddie's death is a couple months after, so it's really one of the last. I think it's the last match they ever have, and they sure wrestled like it. So
well, we're finishing up our part one of what really happened to Chris Benoit. Our first night, of course, has been about Chris Benoit, the wrestler. And next week, we're going to be jumping into the tragedy itself. We're going to be bringing in some facts. We're going to be bringing up some things that actually is in the autopsy report. And we're going to be talking about Wikipedia,
yeah,
which is really strange. And that would to me was the strangest part of the entire thing. And I don't want to mess it up for anybody until next week.
we're,
But
we're gonna have a lot of graphics for you who are watching via Twitch or YouTube. We're gonna have some graphics of different reports, different things, so you can see along with us as we're reading these documents and showing photos and things like that, and just breaking it all down and just going over some different maybe this happened, maybe this happened, because when you look at all of the facts that are presented, it's not as clear cut as they all made it out to be.
absolutely. And
And
I will have some quotes from David Benoit himself, oldest son of Chris Benoit. I'm also going to go through an article from Bleacher Report that's very emotional of a Chris Benoit fan that a lot of people might not have had a chance to read. And so it's going to be an interesting show next week. It's going to be an emotional show. A lot of people are. It's either going to help you to think maybe something didn't happen, or it's going to make you even more angrier that you feel like that he did do it.
I,
And
either way, before we go, I just want to say, um, in regards to the tragedy, it is completely sad that his son Daniel and Nancy passed away
Yes.
because they did not deserve that at all.
No, they did not.
And I just want to put that out there because that is an important part that a lot of people don't talk about. They just talk about Chris. And he's obviously a big part of it because of his stature and how popular he was. So he's obviously going to be a fixture of this. But I don't want people to think that, because we're talking about Chris, we've forgotten about Daniel and Nancy, because we haven't.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a young kid who, if you watch Dark Side of the Ring, David's quoted in saying they wanted to be tag team champions one day. They wanted to follow in their dad's footsteps and be wrestlers.
And Nancy, that had a very good career in wrestling.
I mean, she did. She started off, valeting Kevin Sullivan in WCW, and then eventually went with Chris, and we'll get into all that. But I mean, she was one of the, valets before valets were cool.
Didn't she also valet Flair for a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, I mean, she was kind of all over the place after the whole, Kevin Sullivan thing. But yeah, she was one of the best. I mean, she was up there with Miss Elizabeth, I could argue.
I agree with that 100%.
Because, in my personal opinion, and you might echo this, Brian, she was to WCW what Miss Elizabeth was to the WWF at the time.
Yeah.
For the Macho Man.
Yeah.
She was that important. So don't get it twisted that we're all about Chris, not about Daniel or Nancy. We care just as much about them as we do Chris. So we'll get into obviously more of them next week, but I just wanted to say that before we get off.
That's a good call. That's a good call out. So make sure that you guys are also tuning in to our show on wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon. We have those uploaded usually the same night, and we will definitely be back next week. Do you want to go ahead and throw out some plugs for our sponsors, Tom?
Yeah. So obviously, we're partnered with W Energy. They don't just have energy products, the cans and the powders. They do have hydration as well. So with as hot as it's been this past week across the country, if you're looking for some extra hydration electrolytes, go to w.gg and use our code YRWrestlecast for 10% off your order. For those of you listening to the podcast, I'll put those links to our link tree in there so you guys can click on that and see all we got going on. We got our pop-up shop with all of our shirts and different merch on there. You also find our Patreon, where if you want to support us on there, we have tiers starting at $5, and you get some exclusive stuff with that as well. So if you want to financially support us, jump on the Patreon, help us out. A free way to support us: give us a good review, a 5-star review on all your podcast platforms, and just tune in. Give us your subscriptions, follow us. It just definitely helps us out, and leave us a review and let us know how we're doing.
All right. Again, for Yankee Tommy, I'm Rebel Brian, and we will be back next week with part 2 of the Chris Benoit story. And this is it for part 1 of Chris Benoit, the wrestler. We'll be back next week on every Friday, 7 p.m. right here on Twitch and YouTube. And then, of course, the same night, wherever you get your podcast. Again, we will be back next week with part 2, and we will see you next week, everybody.
See ya.